I'm Michael Prestwich, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Durham, which prefers to call itself Durham University these days. The history of medieval armies, it sounds a very glamorous subject. Gorgeous knights, splendidly dressed on great big horses, armour, lances, swords, charging the enemy, perhaps getting mown down by longbowmen, perhaps engaging in chivalrous single combat. There is that side to it, certainly, but a lot of the history of medieval warfare is actually very much more matter of fact. It's about logistics, it's about recruitment, it's about sieges, it's about armies campaigning, nothing very much happening. What I want to talk about today is one of the less glamorous aspects to do with recruitment, to look particularly at the problems around the notion of feudalism, military feudalism in particular. Feudalism is a very difficult word. It would be nice if we didn't use it at all. It has too many different meanings. You can use it in a very generalized Marxist sense, describing a whole economic system, or you can follow what I suppose most American and British historians have done, and to take it more narrowly in a sense of what I call military feudalism. Now, the basic principle sounds easy enough, that the king would grant out land to great magnates in return for their military service. They would grant out land in turn to knights. They would perform that military service. The service would be for a period of 40 days at a time. And that all sounds very simple, very straightforward, and quite standardized actually through Western Europe. We know about it from Normandy, France, southern Italy, even the Crusader lands. The trouble is, it's not as simple as that. The sources for that theory, there's a splendid inquest that was held in 1166. The barons all sent in returns saying how many knights they'd got, and that gives a tremendous amount of information. But beyond that, if we go back earlier, the sources become much more difficult, and there are some quite tricky questions. The first question is, was all this something new that the Normans brought in with them with the conquest or the Battle of Hastings in 1066? And the old theory was that soon after that, perhaps in about 1070, the conqueror instituted the system of knight service. There's a writ probably from 1072 to the Abbot of Evesham asking him to provide the knights that he owed. It looks therefore as if the service was introduced then. There's the 13th century chronicle that much was made of, Roger Wendover, that indicates that in about 1070 knight service was introduced. But historians don't like nice, simple ideas. They want to complicate it. They want to challenge. That was a notion that was produced in the late 19th century, and historians want to challenge it, to look at different ways. And one attack was to think in terms of, well, wasn't there actually a good deal of continuity with what had happened in the Anglo-Saxon period previously? Didn't they have systems of military service that the Normans, in fact, used and modified? And certainly the Anglo-Saxons had a system whereby, we know this from Domesday Book, every 5 hides of land, a hide is variable in size. It used to be regarded as 120 acres, but it varied a lot. But that each 5 hides of land owed a soldier who would fight in the army, in the Fyrd, as it was called, for a period of 60 days. Now, if you could then show that Norman knights were granted units of 5 hides of land, and that they indeed were serving for 60 days, then that looked like continuity. And that was strongly argued by an American historian, Warren Hollister. There were difficulties. You certainly couldn't show that all Norman knights held units of 5 hides. A few did, but you certainly can't show that's generalised. And 60 days, we certainly know very solidly from 13th century evidence that feudal service was for a period of 40 days. There's no evidence whatsoever of any argument at any stage whereby the barons all came and said, look, you've been charging us 60 days service, we now want to do 40 days. Nothing of that sort is recorded anywhere. The argument for 60 days is quite technical in a way. You could pay instead of doing feudal service. If you paid 30 shillings in lieu instead of doing your service, and if it was the case that a knight was paid sixpence a day, that 30 shillings would hire you a knight at sixpence a day for 60 days. That was what Hollister thought, and he felt that this was fine. That proved 60 days. The trouble is that that rate of 30 shillings was used on occasion, but other rates are also used. And one rate that was used was 26 and 8 pence. That sounds an odd sum of money, but it's in fact 2 marks or 4/3 of a pound. And if you had someone paying 26 and 8 pence, if a knight was paid not 6pence a day, but 8 pence a day, and there's some good evidence for 8 pence a day, that would work out at a 40-day period of service. The case perhaps isn't finally proven, but it seems pretty clear that we should be talking about a 40-day period of service, without any doubt. Now, we need to think hard about what the evidence really is. And one of the problems, and this was brought out by historian John Gillingham, is that if you look at the 11th century, the post-conquest period, there is actually startlingly little evidence. He looked at the history of 15 Anglo-Norman churches to see if there's evidence there in the chronicles that were written about them of the introduction of night service. None of them mention anything of the sort. If you look at more obvious sources, if you look at Domesday Book, there's nothing about night service there at all. Admittedly, one of the best chroniclers of the period, Orderic Vitalis, does describe, he says that William the Conqueror wrote that William distributed land to his knights so that he got service of 60,000 knights. It's a rather vague statement. It can support certainly the idea of an introduction of feudal service, but it's a rare statement, and you have to set that against the silence of lots of other sources. One thing you can look at, of course, is grants, because there are some grants from this period that refer to service. They're surprisingly unspecific in some cases, that you get the Abbot of Westminster making a grant of for life to a knight in return for his service. That's not what happened later, when grants were in full hereditary right that son would succeed father in this land. There's another from the Bishop of Hereford, that a knight should serve the bishop with 2 knights as his father did. That looks like hereditary tenure, but in fact the land concerned was not actually the land that his father had held. These grants show that the beginnings of the practice of granting land out in return for service, but certainly it's not the fully fledged hereditary system with a lot of other burdens of turning up at court, paying feudal aids or taxes at certain given points, like the paying a tax for the knighting of the lord's eldest son, things of that sort. They start only appearing in the 12th century. Full hereditary right, yes, by the middle of the 12th century, probably. There's some historians who would date that even later. But it certainly doesn't look like a fully fledged system suddenly introduced in about 1070. Now, if we then look at how did service actually operate in practice, what evidence have we got for knights holding land in return for service, turning up and actually fighting on campaign? Historians actually haven't looked very hard at this, perhaps not surprisingly, because there is startling little evidence for it. There are no records of any feudal musters until the 13th century. There is no proper summons of the feudal host. We've got the summons to the Abbot of Evesham, yes, but otherwise we have to move again right on to the 13th century for proper requests to all the tenants-in-chief to produce the service that they owe. We know certainly about some armies that had got a component of knights serving in return for land. William Rufus, for example, complained in the course of his quarrels with his Archbishop Anselm, complained about the quality of the knights that had been sent from Canterbury, clearly feudal service. We know that Henry II summoned a feudal host to serve in Ireland in the early 1170s. We know that at the end of his reign, 1186, that a feudal summons was issued for service in Galloway. Actually, the army never got into Galloway, but the summons was issued, the army clearly assembled. We've got a reference in the end of the 12th century, a guy called William Lovell in 1197, whose lands were forfeited because he hadn't gone to fight in Normandy as he'd been requested to. Though we don't know that that's necessarily a feudal summons, but it looks as if it possibly was. But the evidence really is astonishingly light if you look for chronicles saying this year a feudal summons was issued for the army to assemble. They just don't say that.